I remember that night with a strange clarity, as if every detail branded itself into my memory with deliberate cruelty. I wasn't searching for anything, not even suspicious. In fact, I had gone to bed early, scrolling absent-mindedly on my phone, letting the algorithm serve me distractions while I prepared to drift off. That was when a notification popped up. Someone I vaguely knew had tagged my fiancé in a live stream. My curiosity was casual, the kind that usually lasts no longer than a few seconds, the type you forget the moment you swipe past. But this time, something compelled me to click. Perhaps it was intuition, perhaps just accident. But the second the video began playing, my entire world tilted into something unrecognizable. There he was, my fiancé, the man I trusted, the man I planned to build a life with, sitting on a couch with a few of his friends, holding a drink like a trophy, his voice slightly slurred, but clear enough to slice through the fog of chatter around him. At first I thought it was harmless, just him being cocky in front of an audience of strangers, until I caught the sentence that froze my blood. "Of course I've still got it." He laughed, head tilted back, a grin plastered across his face. "I slept with my ex not long ago. She has no idea." The words fell into the room with a weight so heavy that I almost dropped my phone. I replayed them in my mind, hoping I had misheard, hoping the noise of the live distorted what he really said. But the laughter of his friends, the smirk that played across his lips, and the comments that began flooding the screen told me otherwise. They were congratulating him, mocking me without even knowing my name. In their minds, I was just some faceless fool in the background of his story. My pulse raced, but strangely, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. It was as if my body knew better than my heart, choosing instead to quiet everything, to numb me so I could absorb the truth without shattering completely. I watched every second, letting the humiliation wrap around me, colder and tighter with each laugh, each boast, each drunken nod of approval he received from those who knew nothing of me, or worse, knew and didn't care. I thought of the nights he had looked me in the eyes, promising honesty, promising commitment, promising that all his past was behind him, and here he was, entertaining strangers and so-called friends, reducing me to a punchline, bragging about a betrayal as though it were some badge of honor. I should have turned it off. I should have spared myself, but I couldn't. Instead, I leaned closer, memorizing his tone, the exact smirk that curved his lips, the careless way he leaned forward when someone asked him, "Does she really not know?" And he shook his head with almost gleeful cruelty, replying, "She has no clue." Not a single clue. He emphasized it like a magician proud of his illusion, and the audience laughed with him, oblivious to the fact that the illusion had already cracked, that the rabbit was out of the hat and staring him down. I realized then that betrayal has a strange taste. It's not just bitter. It's metallic, like blood in your mouth after biting your tongue too hard. It lingers on your tongue and burns down your throat. But above all, it sharpens you. As I sat there, phone in hand, watching the person I loved strip away the future we had been building, something inside me calcified. The girl who would have broken down, begging for explanations, died quietly in that moment. What remained was someone colder, quieter, someone who knew the value of silence when facing arrogance. When the live ended, I didn't throw my phone across the room. I didn't storm out of the house or call him screaming. Instead, I scrolled back, saved the video, captured the comments, archived the evidence like a meticulous collector. I thought about how easily he had exposed himself, how little he valued what we had, and how certain he was that I would remain blind. That certainty was going to be his undoing. He had created a narrative in which I was the fool, the loyal fiancé who cooked, who planned, who supported him, while he sneered behind my back. But he underestimated something crucial, the way silence can become a weapon sharper than any scream. As I stared at the frozen screen on my phone, his laughing face paused mid-boast. I felt the clarity spread through me like ice water. This wasn't going to be just a breakup, not a confrontation filled with tears and accusations. No, this was going to be something different. I wasn't going to allow him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. If he had turned my trust into entertainment, then I would turn his arrogance into the stage for his collapse. I didn't yet know how, but the seed had been planted. The evidence was in my hands, and with it, a strange calm settled over me. That was the moment everything shifted. The live stream, meant for strangers and casual friends, had become my initiation into a different kind of clarity. I now knew what I was dealing with, who he truly was beneath the charming mask he wore so effortlessly. And if he thought that his little performance had gone unnoticed, he was about to learn that the audience he never accounted for, the one woman whose opinion actually mattered, was watching the whole time. It was in that silence, in the quiet aftermath of the discovery, that my story truly began. Not as a victim who stumbled upon betrayal, but as someone who would choose to write the ending differently, to turn his careless laughter into the echo of his own undoing. And as I closed my phone and lay back down, staring at the ceiling, I already knew this wasn't the end. This was just the first act. The hours after the live stream felt like an endless stretch of silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing, which had become shallow and deliberate, as though each inhale and exhale needed my conscious effort to keep me alive. I lay in bed, my phone heavy in my hand, his frozen grin still etched on the screen, taunting me like some grotesque portrait of arrogance. My first instinct was to feel shame, the kind that curls into your stomach and eats at you from within, whispering that you must have been blind, that you should have seen the signs long ago, that perhaps you were never enough and this was inevitable. The comments that had scrolled past during his drunken confession echoed in my mind like cruel little voices. She must be clueless. Man, you're a legend. Poor girl. They weren't just words on a screen. They became ghosts that hovered in my room, circling me, gnawing at my sense of worth. But then, almost against my will, a counterweight rose within me, something steady and cold, a clarity I had not expected. Shame might have been my first guest, but it would not be allowed to stay. I thought back to all the times he had kissed me goodbye before going out, the way he had assured me he was too tired to see friends, the excuses that, in hindsight, were nothing more than poorly crafted lines delivered with just enough conviction to keep me from questioning. I remembered the gentle pressure of his hand on mine during dinners, the way he used to brush my hair out of my face and tell me he loved me. And with each memory, a strange duality surfaced. Yes, there was humiliation in realizing those gestures had been tainted by deceit, but there was also a strange, almost surgical awareness settling into me. He hadn't humiliated me because I was weak. He had humiliated himself by thinking cruelty could be disguised as strength. What he thought was power, the ability to lie, to laugh at me, to parade his betrayal in front of others, was nothing but a performance that had already begun to collapse the moment I saw it. The more I sat with the silence, the more I understood its usefulness. Most people, when faced with betrayal, either explode in anger or drown in grief. They shout, they cry, they demand answers, they beg for explanations that never truly satisfy. But silence, I realized, is different. Silence unnerves. It confuses. It creates space for thought, for planning, for precision. And in that stillness, I began to see paths forming, choices opening before me like doors in a long corridor. I didn't need to confront him immediately, nor did I need to break down in front of anyone. What I needed was patience, the kind of patience that could turn his laughter into a weapon against him. I imagined briefly what it would look like if I simply forgave him, if I decided to bury what I had seen and continue forward, pretending it never happened. But the thought left me hollow, a version of myself I could never respect again. Forgiveness, when forced, is not healing. It is surrender. And I wasn't going to surrender to a man who had already declared war on my dignity without even knowing it. I thought of my future, the one we had mapped out in vague conversations and whispered promises, and realized that it no longer existed. The wedding dress, the plans for a shared apartment, the ideas of children one day, all of it had dissolved in the span of a 30-second boast to strangers online. It stung, but it also liberated me. There was no longer a chain binding me to the illusion. What remained was raw, undeniable truth. Shame still tried to creep back in, of course. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him laughing, shaking his head when asked if I knew, reveling in my supposed ignorance. The humiliation wasn't just in the act of betrayal, it was in his performance, his delight in being the clever one, the manipulator who believed he had outsmarted the woman who trusted him. But even as those images played in my mind, I began to reshape them. I no longer saw myself as the butt of his joke. I saw him as a fool trapped in his own arrogance, a man whose pride had made him careless enough to document his betrayal for anyone to see. I had proof. I had evidence. And in that, there was power. The clarity that grew inside me wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, methodical, almost eerie. It whispered that I didn't need to rush, that the best revenge was never born out of impulsive fury, but out of careful, deliberate action. If he thought he had control, I would let him keep thinking so. Let him laugh. Let him continue living in his illusion of superiority. All the while, I would be planning, watching, preparing. The live stream, which he had treated as a casual moment of bravado, had become the cornerstone of something far greater than he could imagine. By the time the sun began to rise, painting faint streaks of gray and orange across my window, I had stopped replaying the video. I no longer needed to. The words were engraved into me, but instead of burning, they had crystallized into something solid I could hold on to. The shame had dulled. The humiliation no longer consumed me. In its place was a strange calmness, the kind that comes not from acceptance, but from strategy. I knew what I had to do, and I knew that when the time came, he would never see it coming. He believed I was blind. He believed I was powerless. But silence, my silence, was going to be the rope he had unknowingly wrapped around his own neck. As I finally set my phone down and forced myself to stand, my legs weak but steadying with each step, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow from the night's revelations. But there was something new there too. An edge, a determination that hadn't existed before. This was not the face of someone broken. This was the face of someone who had been given clarity in the cruelest way possible and had decided to use it. And as I looked at myself, I whispered words not aloud, but deep inside. This is not the end. This is where the silence begins, and where his downfall will be written. In the days that followed, the silence I had chosen for myself became a cloak, one I wore carefully as I moved through the motions of ordinary life, while carrying the weight of something extraordinary, something poisonous, just beneath the surface. He still texted me as if nothing had happened, still called me with his easy charm and shallow reassurances, the mask firmly in place. To him, nothing had changed. To me, everything had. I could no longer look at his words without seeing the shadow of that live stream behind them, his laughter etched into every syllable, his betrayal seeping into even the simplest gestures. And yet, I answered, calm, measured, almost detached, never betraying that I already knew, never giving him reason to suspect that the illusion had shattered, because I needed time to dig deeper, to uncover not just what he had done, but who he had done it with. The ex. That word alone had begun to gnaw at me, a figure half hidden in the fog of his past, someone I had been aware of but had never felt threatened by. He had spoken of her once or twice, casually, with the vague disdain men often use when they want to reassure you that the past is buried. "She's nothing," he had said once, brushing off my curiosity, and I had believed him, because belief is the currency of trust, and I had still been wealthy with it then. But now, that ghost of his past had been resurrected, summoned into my present by his own arrogance. I couldn't move forward without knowing who she was, where she stood, and why he still felt entitled to cross that line. I started small, a search here, a glimpse there, following threads across social media like a detective moving quietly through the shadows. It didn't take long to find her. Her name still tagged in old posts, her face still present in photographs he had never bothered to erase from the corners of the internet. At first glance, she was unremarkable. Another woman with curated smiles and filtered snapshots of vacations, dinners, and nights out with friends. But the more I looked, the more I realized something that made my stomach tighten. She wasn't single. There, on her profile, was the evidence. Photos with another man. Not old ones, but recent. Captions filled with affection. Declarations that mirrored the kind I used to receive. She had someone. A partner who looked at her the way I had once looked at him. That realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just that my fiancé had betrayed me. It was that she had betrayed someone too. This wasn't just a private crack in our relationship. It was a fracture that rippled outward, touching lives beyond mine. I stared at those pictures, her arm around him, his smile wide and genuine, and I wondered if he knew, if he had any idea that the woman he loved was entangled in this same deceit. Did he suspect? Had he been fed the same lies I had swallowed so easily? The thought unsettled me, not because it lessened my own pain, but because it multiplied it. Betrayal rarely travels alone. It drags others down with it, ensnaring them in the web of arrogance and selfishness, spun by those who think loyalty is just a word. For hours I hovered over the decision of whether to reach out to him, this stranger whose life had been wounded in tandem with mine. I didn't know his name, not yet, but I knew his face, his laughter captured in videos she had shared, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. He was real, not just a figure in the background of her life, but a man who had unknowingly joined me in a cruel theater where the people we trusted most were actors playing us for fools. And in that realization, something stirred in me, not pity, but a recognition, a kinship born out of suffering. He was out there, unaware, walking through his days with the same illusion I had once carried, and I knew that sooner or later, his illusion would shatter too. I began to gather everything carefully. Screenshots of her posts, timestamps of his live stream, the overlapping pieces that connected the puzzle together. This wasn't hysteria. It wasn't a jealous spiral. It was evidence, collected with the precision of someone who knew the importance of truth. The more I uncovered, the less I felt the urge to scream or confront. Instead, I felt steady, deliberate, as though I were preparing a case, not for a courtroom, but for the quiet reckoning that was to come. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about truth, about justice, about not letting their arrogance remain unchecked while two people, the fiancé and the boyfriend, were left to shoulder humiliation in silence. At night, lying in bed next to the man who still believed I was blind, I felt the presence of her in the room, not as a rival, but as another player in this twisted story. And I thought of him, the other man, sleeping somewhere else with no idea that the woman beside him had been reduced to a boast on a live stream, her loyalty shattered just as mine had been. I wondered what he would do if he knew. Would he rage? Would he leave her? Or would he, like me, find clarity in silence? I didn't yet know, but the possibility lingered like smoke, filling the edges of my thoughts. By the end of that week, I had pieced together enough to know the truth in its entirety. My fiancé had not only betrayed me, but had done so with someone who was equally false, equally complicit in weaving lies to protect their fragile egos. And in that discovery, I felt something shift. My shame no longer stood alone. It was mirrored in him, in the man whose life had been entangled with hers. We were both pawns in their game, but pawns have a way of reaching the other side of the board if they're patient enough. And when they do, they become something powerful. As I closed my laptop one evening, the glow of her smiling photos still burned into my eyes. I realized the path was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about alignment, about finding strength not in isolation, but in connection. I didn't know him yet, not personally, but soon I would. And together, our silence could turn into something far louder than their laughter had ever been. The decision to reach out to him did not come in a burst of impulsive courage, but rather in the same quiet calculation that had begun guiding every step of my life since that night. For days, I carried the knowledge of his existence like a secret weight, imagining his routines, his unknowing smiles, the way he might greet her after work with a kiss on the cheek or a question about her day, never suspecting that the woman he loved had already reduced him to a footnote in her own deception. It gnawed at me, not because I wanted to save him, but because I could not ignore the symmetry of our suffering. We were both living inside lies crafted by people who believed themselves too clever to be caught. And in that symmetry, I sensed the possibility of something dangerous, a union, a shared clarity that could transform humiliation into power. I began with hesitation, hovering over the message box on his profile, writing drafts that I would delete, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from the gravity of what this meant. I couldn't simply write, "Your girlfriend cheated on you with my fiancé." That would be reckless, cruel even, a hammer swung without precision. No, this required delicacy, a careful introduction of truth, a way of breaking the illusion without shattering him entirely in a single blow. I crafted the words slowly, choosing each one as though I were dismantling a bomb. Hi, you don't know me, but I believe there's something important you need to see. It involves your girlfriend and my fiancé. I wouldn't reach out if I weren't certain. I have proof. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. That was all I sent. Simple, unadorned, yet heavy with implication. The hours that followed stretched unbearably. Every notification set my heart racing. Every vibration of my phone a potential explosion. When his reply finally came, it was short, cautious, but it carried a weight I recognized instantly. What kind of proof? I knew then that suspicion already lived somewhere inside him, faint but present, like a hairline crack in a wall that had gone unnoticed until now. My next step was to send him the video, not in its entirety, but a clipped portion, the part where my fiancé's voice, steady in its arrogance, said, "I slept with my ex. She has no idea." I left it at that, not adding commentary, not trying to frame it. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could have written. Minutes passed, then an hour, then longer, until at last he responded. His words were scattered, fragmented, the kind that come when a mind is reeling. I don't know what to say. I can't believe this, but I can't deny it either. It's her. It's them. God. Reading his words was like looking into a mirror. His disbelief, his fury, his dawning recognition of betrayal all echoed what I had lived just nights before. But where I had been alone, he now had me, and I had him. There was comfort in that, not the soft comfort of affection, but the hard, cold comfort of shared truth. We agreed to meet, not immediately but within days, in a quiet cafe far from the neighborhoods we each called home. When I walked in, scanning the room for the man whose face I had studied in photographs, I found him sitting at a corner table, hunched forward, his fingers laced tightly together as though trying to keep himself from unraveling. He looked up when I approached, and in his eyes, I saw the same storm that lived in me: grief, anger, humiliation, but beneath it all, an ember of resolve. I sat across from him, and for a moment we simply stared, both aware of the strangeness of our connection, strangers bound together by the cruelty of those who had once claimed to love us. Our conversation began haltingly, with the awkward politeness of two people who would rather not be meeting under such circumstances. But soon, the dam broke. He asked me to replay the video, his jaw tightening as the words spilled from the screen. I showed him the screenshots, the comments, the timestamps that tied everything together. In return, he shared with me the signs he now realized he had ignored: the late nights, the evasive answers, the sudden flares of secrecy in someone who once posted every detail of her life online. It became painfully clear that the betrayal was not a mistake, not a lapse, but a deliberate act of deception carried out with arrogance, as though neither of us mattered enough to notice. As the conversation stretched on, something shifted between us. What had begun as mutual suffering grew into an unspoken alliance. There was no need to declare it aloud, but we both understood. We would not let this end with us walking away quietly, licking our wounds while they carried on unscathed. No, the humiliation had to be returned, measured out with the same cold precision they had shown in hiding it. I saw the determination harden in his features as he said, almost to himself, "They can't be allowed to just laugh at us. Not after this." And I nodded, because the same thought had already been living inside me. When we parted that evening, the weight of solitude had lessened. I no longer felt like the only one carrying this secret, this evidence, this ache. Now it was shared, doubled perhaps, but also fortified. Together, we had become something neither of them had anticipated: a quiet, deliberate force, bound not by love but by betrayal, sharpened not by passion but by pain. And as I walked away from the cafe, the night air cold against my skin, I realized that the story had shifted again. It was no longer just mine to bear. It was ours. And from that union, something was beginning to form. A plan. A reckoning that neither of them could see coming. The meeting with him had left a strange aftertaste. bitter yet strangely invigorating, as though something dormant inside me had finally been stirred awake. For the first time since I discovered the live stream, I no longer felt as if I were drifting aimlessly through humiliation. I had an ally now, someone who had seen the same darkness I had, and chosen not to collapse beneath it. When I returned home that evening, the weight of his gaze still fresh in my memory, I felt the silence of my apartment differently. It was no longer oppressive. It was fertile. Plans could be born here, in this silence, nurtured by restraint and sharpened by purpose. What had begun as a wound was beginning to take the shape of strategy. The first step was clarity. We exchanged messages late into the nights, piecing together timelines, comparing notes, building a shared ledger of betrayal. His girlfriend's late-night study sessions aligned with my fiancé's sudden bursts of unavailability. A business trip excuse mirrored a night she claimed she was visiting family. Patterns emerged, undeniable, stretching across weeks, maybe months. The arrogance of their confidence had left them sloppy. Their lies, fragile threads easily unraveled when observed from two sides instead of one. With every revelation, the ache inside me hardened into something crystalline, a resolve that hummed with cold intensity. But planning revenge is not the same as venting anger. We both knew this instinctively. To scream at them, to storm into their lives with accusations, would only give them a stage on which to twist the story, to make us look hysterical, bitter, unhinged. They would deny, they would deflect, they would mock us again, this time to our faces. That was unacceptable. Our plan needed to be careful, deliberate, undeniable, not rage-driven but measured. We weren't just seeking personal satisfaction. We wanted them undone, socially, emotionally, perhaps even professionally, not destroyed by violence, but by exposure. The kind of exposure that once lit could never be dimmed. We began sketching possibilities like architects of quiet ruin. The video was our cornerstone, the confession too raw and clear to be dismissed. But we couldn't simply release it into the void. That would be reckless, messy. It had to be timed, contextualized, orchestrated so that when it surfaced, it would land like a guillotine blade, cutting through their defenses with one swing. We talked about places, occasions where their guard would be down, where the performance of their perfect selves would be most vulnerable to interruption. A dinner party among friends, a professional event, a gathering where their reputations mattered. The thought of their laughter freezing mid-smile, of their faces draining of color as their own words betrayed them in front of witnesses. It was not joy I felt in imagining it, but a grim satisfaction, the equilibrium of justice restored. Yet there was more than just the act of exposure. Psychological pressure, we realized, was its own form of revenge. We could plant shadows in their lives, subtle reminders that they were not as clever as they believed, that their secrets were no longer safe. An anonymous message here, a misplaced reminder there, things small enough to be dismissed yet unsettling enough to gnaw at their confidence, not enough to reveal ourselves, but enough to keep them off balance, to make them suspect cracks in their illusion long before the collapse. Because true punishment is not a single blow. It is the slow erosion of certainty, the steady unraveling of confidence until panic becomes second nature. He was fiercer than I expected, his words laced with a kind of quiet rage that mirrored my own. But where I carried my vengeance in icy silence, he carried his like a steady fire, controlled, but burning. We balanced each other. His urgency tempered my restraint, and my caution shaped his fervor into precision. Together, we began to draft not just one plan but layers of them, contingencies for every possible reaction. If they denied, we had evidence. If they tried to shift blame, we had timelines. If they mocked us again, we had allies prepared to bear witness. Each scenario was rehearsed in our minds, like generals studying a battlefield before war. There were moments, of course, when doubt seeped in. Late at night, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if I was transforming into something I wouldn't recognize. Was I still myself? Or had I allowed their betrayal to sculpt me into this cold strategist who thought in terms of humiliation and ruin? But then I remembered his laugh, the way he shook his head so confidently when asked if I knew, the cruelty in his certainty that I was blind. That memory hardened me again. They had chosen this path when they reduced us to entertainment. Now they would learn that the audience they mocked had teeth. One evening, as we sat across from each other in that same cafe, papers spread between us like conspirators planning a heist, he said something that crystallized the essence of what we were doing. "Revenge doesn't need to shout," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the evidence between us. "It just needs to be undeniable." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep into my bones. What we were crafting was not noise, not drama. It was inevitability. A sequence of events set in motion so carefully that by the time they realized the trap had closed, it would already be too late. When I left that night, the air outside sharp with the scent of rain, I felt something unfamiliar rising in me. Not hope exactly, not joy, but a strange form of strength. They thought we were blind, weak, humiliated. They thought their laughter would echo unchallenged. But they had underestimated the resilience of silence, the power of those who refused to be broken. The plan was forming, piece by piece, and soon the stage would be set. And when the curtain finally rose, it would not be us standing exposed in the spotlight. It would be them, stripped of their illusions, their laughter silenced by their own arrogance. It started with the smallest of things, details so subtle that anyone less arrogant than him might have brushed them off as coincidence. But arrogance has a way of turning even the faintest ripple into a disturbance, because those who believe themselves untouchable are the first to panic when the ground shifts beneath them. At first, I did nothing overt. I still answered his calls, still smiled when he texted me sweet nothings, still sat across from him during dinners with the same calm expression I had always worn. Yet the difference was there, hidden in the silence between my words, in the moments I let my gaze linger a fraction too long, in the questions I didn't ask when once I might have. Silence can be louder than accusation, and he began to hear it, though he couldn't yet name it. He would look at me sometimes, his brow furrowed ever so slightly, as if trying to measure the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. I could see the doubt flicker across his face, but then he would smother it quickly, laughing too loudly at his own jokes, holding my hand a little tighter, overcompensating for the unease he could not shake. Once, while we were watching television, he glanced at me and asked casually, "You okay? You've been quieter lately." I smiled, kissed his cheek, and said I was just tired. He accepted it, but the suspicion lingered in his eyes. It was the beginning of something he could not control, and he felt it, even if he didn't yet understand why. Meanwhile, the man who shared my burden and I continued weaving threads of unease into their lives. An anonymous account liked one of her photos, a photo taken on the very day she had claimed to be with family, but had in truth been with him. A forgotten receipt slipped onto his desk from a dinner they had shared, placed so discreetly he could never know if it had been chance or intention. Little reminders, subtle ghosts of their betrayal resurfacing in ways they could not predict. They would dismiss them outwardly, perhaps laugh them off together, but beneath the surface, unease was taking root. For my fiancé, it was in the way he began checking his phone more often, in the way he lingered before answering my questions, as though calculating what I might already know. I noticed his sleep becoming restless. Nights that once passed with him snoring softly now stretched with tossing and turning, his breathing uneven, his body shifting beneath the sheets as if trying to escape some invisible weight pressing down on him. He would wake earlier than usual, sit on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, staring into nothing. When I asked if he was all right, he would smile too quickly, mutter something about stress at work, and brush it away. But I knew it wasn't work. It was the first cracks forming in the facade he had built, hairline fractures that would only grow deeper with time. It fascinated me to watch, not with joy, but with the kind of detached observation one reserves for a structure slowly collapsing under its own weakness. He didn't know yet what was wrong, but he knew something had shifted. He sensed a trap, but couldn't see it. Heard the echo of footsteps behind him, but couldn't catch the figure casting the shadow. That confusion was part of the plan. It was the erosion of certainty, the slow unraveling of his confidence. His arrogance had once been a fortress. Now it was becoming a cage, tightening with each passing day. There were moments when his unease slipped into small acts of control. He began asking more questions about my day, not in the affectionate way he once did, but with an edge of suspicion, as though hoping to catch me in a slip of words. He asked where I had been, who I had seen, what I had done, each question disguised as casual but sharpened by fear. I answered with calm simplicity, never faltering, never giving him reason to accuse me of anything. The steadier I remained, the more unstable he became. It was as if he were fighting shadows only he could see, and every time he tried to grasp them, they slipped through his fingers. Even his laughter changed. The easy, careless laugh that had once filled rooms began to sound hollow, forced, punctuated by glances to see if I was laughing too. Sometimes I would, sometimes I wouldn't, and in the inconsistency, his doubt deepened. He began to drink more when we went out, the alcohol a desperate attempt to drown the unease gnawing at him. But alcohol has a way of amplifying fear rather than silencing it, and soon, in his drunkenness, I saw the cracks widen. One night, as he stumbled through the door, he looked at me with a strange intensity and muttered, "You'd tell me if something was wrong, right? You'd tell me if you knew something?" His words slurred, his voice unsteady, but his eyes were wide, desperate for reassurance. I gave it to him with a gentle smile, brushing his hair back, whispering that of course I would. But inside, I knew the silence was destroying him more effectively than any accusation could. The man who shared my secret, and I spoke often about these changes, trading observations, marveling at how quickly the pressure was beginning to bend them. She too was showing signs of unease, he said. She was becoming more irritable, more defensive, lashing out at small things, accusing him of questioning her when he hadn't said a word. Their lies were beginning to turn inward, festering, poisoning even the moments they thought were safe. The walls were closing in, and though they didn't yet know it, they were the ones pulling them tighter. What struck me most was how powerless he looked when stripped of certainty. The man who had once laughed so freely at my supposed ignorance now stumbled through his days second-guessing every look, every silence, every coincidence. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it, like a storm building on the horizon. And as I watched him unravel piece by piece, I realized something important. Revenge isn't just about the final blow. It's about the anticipation, the dread, the slow suffocation of knowing something is wrong, but not being able to stop it. He was already unraveling, and the game had only just begun. The night of the confrontation had been decided with the same precision as everything that came before. It wasn't going to be explosive in the way people imagine when they think of betrayal. No shouting, no dishes thrown, no melodrama fit for a soap opera. That would have given him an advantage, a way to paint me as hysterical, unhinged, perhaps even to twist the narrative into one where he was the victim of my supposed volatility. No, our confrontation would be a scalpel, not a hammer. A single, deliberate incision made in public, in front of witnesses whose opinions mattered to him far more than mine ever had in his private calculations. It was in the company of others, surrounded by the fragile ecosystem of reputation and appearances, that his mask would finally be torn away. The opportunity came in the form of a gathering hosted by one of his colleagues, a dinner party meant to celebrate a new contract he and his team had secured. He insisted I come with him, parading me as the doting fiancé he had always described to others, the silent accessory who reinforced his image of success and stability. I agreed with a smile, the kind that must have reassured him, because he didn't notice the way my silence had deepened into something almost reverent, like the calm before a storm. Across town, she would also be present, brought along by her partner, the man who now stood beside me in this strange alliance. The symmetry of it all was almost poetic. The betrayers, basking in their arrogance, stepping willingly into the stage we had prepared, unaware of the trap tightening around them. The evening began as expected. Glasses clinked, polite laughter echoed across the room. Conversations about business and travel and shallow triumphs filled the air. He thrived in these settings, my fiancé, basking in the attention of others, weaving his charm like a net that had always caught me before. But tonight, I was immune. I watched him move among the guests, his hand brushing mine with rehearsed affection, his smile stretching wide, oblivious to the fissures forming beneath him. Across the room, I caught sight of her. She looked radiant, laughing at something her partner said, but I saw the nervous flicker in her eyes when they darted briefly to him, my fiancé, and the silent acknowledgement passed between them. A flicker, brief but undeniable. I saw it. And more importantly, so did the man standing at her side. The plan was simple. Timing was everything. At the height of the evening, when the laughter was loudest, when the room was warm with the illusion of celebration, the truth would enter like an uninvited guest. We waited. My heart pounded not with fear, but with a steady rhythm of inevitability. I sipped my wine, engaged in small talk, laughed when expected, all while the weight of my phone in my hand reminded me of the evidence waiting to be unveiled. And then the moment came. A toast was proposed, glasses lifted, voices raised in cheer. As the room settled into that delicate silence that follows a collective gesture, I took a step forward, my smile calm, my voice steady as I said, "Before we celebrate, I think there's something everyone should see." A hush fell, curious eyes turning toward me, some amused, some puzzled. I unlocked my phone, tapped the screen, and the room filled not with my words but with his. His voice, captured in careless arrogance, played through the speaker. Of course I've still got it. I slept with my ex not long ago. She has no idea. The effect was instantaneous. The air thickened. Laughter choked mid-breath. Glasses paused halfway to lips. His face froze, the color draining as though the life had been pulled from him in a single second. The room was utterly still, the silence not one of politeness but of collective shock, disbelief curdling into judgment. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to raise my voice. His own words, replayed in that setting, stripped him bare in a way nothing else could. He stammered, tried to laugh, muttered something about it being a joke, taken out of context, but the desperation in his tone betrayed him. No one was convinced. They had heard the laughter in his voice, the pride in his admission. There was no context that could cleanse it. Across the room she paled, her glass slipping slightly in her hand. Her partner turned to her slowly, his expression a mask of disbelief and betrayal. He didn't need to ask. The evidence had already answered. Her silence, her trembling lips, condemned her more loudly than any confession could. The symmetry was complete, both of them cornered, their audience no longer cheering admirers, but silent jurors passing judgment. I watched it all unfold with a calm that surprised even me. There was no triumph, no giddy satisfaction, just the steady sense of justice taking shape. He flailed, she crumbled, and around them the walls of reputation they had built so carefully collapsed in real time. Friends averted their eyes, colleagues shifted uncomfortably, the weight of social ruin settling heavily upon them. What had once been private humiliation was now public, undeniable, irreversible. He turned to me then, his eyes wide, his mouth opening as if to plead, but I met his gaze without flinching. I didn't need to speak. My silence was the final verdict, the echo of all the words he had once dismissed, all the truths he had mocked. And in that silence, he understood that the game had turned, that his laughter had been transformed into the very rope tightening around his throat. When I finally stepped back, leaving him to his stammered excuses and the withering stares of those who had once admired him, I felt a strange stillness settle inside me. It wasn't joy, nor was it sorrow. It was clarity. The confrontation had not been about revenge alone. It had been about truth, about balance, about ensuring that what was done in arrogance was revealed in equal measure. And as the night unraveled into whispers and accusations, I knew this was only the beginning of their undoing. The first public crack had appeared, and from here, the collapse would only deepen. The aftermath of that night unfolded like a series of falling dominoes, each one tipping into the next with a rhythm that seemed both inevitable and merciless. Once the words had left the speaker of my phone, once their faces had drained of color, and the crowd had absorbed the full weight of what had been revealed, there was no rewinding, no salvaging, no room left for denial to rebuild the fragile scaffolding of their lies. What began as whispers in that crowded room quickly hardened into judgment, and judgment, once seated, spreads faster than wildfire. My fiancé tried to contain it at first, pulling me aside with a grip on my arm that was both desperate and trembling, hissing under his breath about misunderstandings and context, his words tumbling over themselves in their eagerness to stitch together an excuse. But I didn't need to answer him. My silence was enough. It left him flailing, his eyes darting around the room for allies who were no longer there. Meanwhile, across the room, the ex's partner was unraveling in a different way. Unlike me, he had not spent weeks in silence, building steel around his emotions. The revelation struck him raw, a blade slicing without warning. I saw his expression shift from disbelief to fury in a matter of seconds, his voice raised in a tone that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "How long?" he demanded of her, his hand trembling as it clenched into a fist at his side. She tried to placate him, tried to spin it as nothing more than a drunken exaggeration, but her words faltered beneath the crushing weight of what everyone had just heard. Her silence between his questions condemned her more than any admission ever could. In the days that followed, their implosion became a spectacle all its own. What had been exposed publicly became fodder for private wars. My fiancé began calling incessantly, his messages swinging wildly between apologies drenched in desperation and accusations flung in bitterness. One moment he wrote that he loved me, that it had been a stupid mistake, that he was drunk, that he never meant to hurt me. The next moment he accused me of betrayal, of conspiring against him, of humiliating him intentionally to ruin his career. It was almost laughable, his inability to see that he had orchestrated his own downfall long before I pressed play on that recording. His arrogance had always been the first domino, and now he was simply watching the chain reaction unfold. For her, the collapse was just as swift. From what the man who had become my ally told me, their home had turned into a battlefield. She cried, pleaded, insisted that it hadn't meant anything, that it had been a one-time slip, that she still loved him, but he was no longer listening. Betrayal has a way of deafening people to excuses, and he had reached the point where every word out of her mouth sounded like another lie. Their arguments grew louder, their silences colder, until finally, he told me in one of our late-night calls that he had packed her things into boxes and left them by the door. "I don't want to see her face again," he said, his voice steady, not angry anymore but resolute. I found a strange kind of symmetry in the way their downfall mirrored each other's. He and I had been the ones mocked, humiliated, reduced to jokes on a live stream and whispers in the dark. And now they, the ones who had laughed, were tearing themselves apart from the inside out. Their relationship had been built on arrogance, deceit, and the thrill of secret indulgence. But the foundation was always brittle. Once the light of truth had struck it, it crumbled with almost laughable speed. The cracks that began as subtle suspicions widened into chasms, swallowing their fragile bond, until nothing was left but resentment. The implosion wasn't limited to their private lives. At his workplace, my fiancé began to notice the shift in the way his colleagues looked at him. Where once there had been admiration, now there was hesitation. Whispers cut off mid-sentence when he entered the room. That recording had circulated further than he imagined. Screenshots shared, snippets replayed, the echo of his arrogance rippling outward into the networks he relied upon. He tried to act unfazed, doubling down on his charm, but charm cannot mask rot forever. He had lost the one thing he valued above all else, the perception of control. She too faced the social aftermath. Friends distanced themselves, choosing not to answer her calls or invite her to gatherings. The man who had once been her partner had made no secret of what she had done, and in their circle, betrayal spreads like a stain. People recoil, not out of loyalty to the betrayed, but out of fear that deceit might be contagious. She found herself alone, her laughter replaced by quiet desperation, her social currency devalued to nothing. For me and the man who shared my clarity, the unraveling of their relationship was not something we gloated over openly. There was no need. Their implosion was its own punishment, a spectacle they had created for themselves long before we became its witnesses. Still, there was a certain satisfaction in the symmetry of it all. The laughter that had once bound them now turned into accusations. The secrecy that had once thrilled them now souring into paranoia. They had mocked us for our trust, and in doing so, they had built their own gallows. What struck me most was how quickly love, or the illusion of it, transformed into contempt once the truth surfaced. Their whispers of affection, their stolen glances, their arrogant boasts, all of it dissolved into shouting matches, slammed doors, and mutual blame. He accused her of leading him astray. She accused him of being reckless enough to brag. In the end, neither could bear the weight of the other's reflection, because to look at each other was to confront the worst in themselves. And so, they chose destruction, each pushing the other further down the slope until there was nothing left but ashes. Watching it unfold, I realized that revenge didn't always require a heavy hand. Sometimes it only required truth, revealed in the right way, at the right time. The rest would take care of itself. Betrayal has its own gravity, pulling everything it touches into collapse. And as the dominoes continued to fall, one after another, I understood that their implosion was not the end of the story. It was only the natural consequence of the arrogance that had started it all. By the time the dust from their implosion began to settle, it was clear to me that the public humiliation and the private collapse were only the first waves of a storm that had yet to reach its peak. The dominoes had fallen in sequence, stripping away their masks, their laughter, their pretense of control, but there remained one last step, the strike that would not merely wound but ensure permanence. Revenge without finality is only half justice. It leaves open the possibility of recovery, of reinvention, of a narrative rewritten to paint themselves as the victims. That could not be allowed. The final blow had to be irreversible, a point of no return that would carve the truth into the bedrock of their lives so deeply that they could never bury it. For him, my fiancé, that blow came through the very arena where he had always believed himself untouchable, his career. His arrogance had not only betrayed me, it had spilled into his professional sphere, carried on the tongues of colleagues who could not resist replaying the infamous live stream clip, sharing it in hushed tones at first, then with less and less restraint. The evidence, raw and undeniable, reached beyond the walls of our social circle. His reputation, once a carefully curated image of responsibility and charm, was now stained with the stink of arrogance and infidelity. I did not need to fabricate anything. I only needed to make sure the evidence reached the right hands. A discreet email to his firm's senior partners, attaching the recording, was all it took. No commentary, no embellishment, only his own words presented in stark clarity. The fallout was swift. A man who built his success on trust and perception cannot survive once that trust is gone. Meetings began without him. Clients requested other representatives, and slowly the polite exclusion became outright dismissal. I heard from acquaintances that he had been pulled aside by his superiors, that he had tried to laugh it off as a joke, a mistake blown out of proportion. But arrogance cannot erase a recording, and charm cannot undo what the world has already heard. Within weeks, the contracts he had once bragged about securing slipped from his hands, reassigned to others deemed more reliable. The career he had weaponized as a badge of superiority crumbled beneath him, leaving him stripped not only of reputation, but of livelihood. For her, the ex who had conspired in arrogance and secrecy, the blow was more personal, but no less devastating. Her partner, the man who had once adored her, did not simply walk away. He made sure her betrayal was known in their circle, not with pettiness, but with clarity. He spoke the truth when asked, never embellishing, never softening, until she became a cautionary tale whispered about in corners, where she once had basked in admiration. Invitations dried up, friendships dissolved, even family began to hold her at a distance, ashamed of the cruelty she had inflicted. The life she had curated online with smiling photographs and declarations of love turned into a hollow shell, comments dwindling to silence, likes fading to nothing. In a world that thrives on image, she had lost hers completely. And then came the final strike, the one that ensured there would be no path back for either of them. Together, he and I made the choice to release the recording publicly, but not recklessly. It wasn't plastered across tabloids or smeared across the internet as gossip. It was shared quietly, strategically, in the spaces where it would matter most. Their professional and social networks, where reputations are currency, and humiliation is never forgotten. We didn't add commentary, we didn't need to. Their voices, their arrogance, their laughter did all the work. And once it was out, there was no retrieving it. The aftermath was almost clinical in its precision. Messages of pity flowed toward me, words of solidarity, whispered apologies from those who had once laughed at his jokes, shaken his hand, admired his confidence. For the first time, the narrative shifted away from me being the fool in his story. Now, he was the fool, the cautionary tale, the man undone by his own arrogance. She was the accomplice, the woman who betrayed not just me, but the man who had loved her. And together, they were marked, not by me, not by my silence or my accusations, but by their own words replayed again and again until they became inseparable from their identities. There was no recovery for them after that. He attempted to salvage some dignity, applying for new positions, trying to convince others that he was still the man they had once respected. But every attempt was met with hesitation, a polite decline, the echo of his own betrayal preceding him into every room. She tried to rebrand herself online, to craft new images of joy, of resilience, but the silence of her once active followers was deafening. Their downfall was complete, not because I had destroyed them with lies, but because I had simply ensured their own truth could not be hidden. For me, the final blow did not bring exhilaration. It was quieter than I expected, almost somber. Watching them unravel was not joy, but closure. The kind of closure that comes from knowing justice has been served, not through vengeance shouted in anger, but through truth wielded with precision. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. I simply let the silence carry me forward, leaving them behind in the ruins of what they had built on arrogance and deceit. It was in that quiet that I realized revenge, at its most effective, does not roar. It whispers. It is not the fire that consumes, but the frost that settles slowly, unshakable, permanent. They would carry the weight of their own voices for the rest of their lives, reminders of a night when their arrogance was exposed, and their laughter became their undoing. That was enough. The final blow had landed, and there was no undoing it. In the end, when the dust had truly settled, and their names had become whispers rather than wounds, I found myself reflecting on the strange, quiet path that had led me here. There had been no explosions, no dramatic scenes of chaos where plates shattered against walls or throats screamed until voices gave out. My revenge had been orchestrated in silence, carried out with precision, unfolding like a symphony that built itself measure by measure, until the final crescendo left them undone. What remained for me afterward was not the heat of victory, but the stillness of survival, the understanding that I had walked through humiliation and betrayal, and emerged on the other side with my dignity intact. There was something profoundly powerful in the fact that I had never raised my voice. I had not begged him for answers he would have twisted into lies. I had not cried in front of him, feeding the arrogance that had always thrived on the belief that I was weaker. I had not confronted her in a flurry of accusations that would have only satisfied her vanity. Instead, I had chosen the path of silence, of patience, of strategy. And in that silence, I had discovered a strength I had never known was mine. It was not the strength of brute force, but the strength of endurance, of clarity, of refusing to let someone else's cruelty define the terms of my response. Life after them was not a fairy tale, not a sudden rush of joy or redemption. Healing never works that way. The nights were still long sometimes. The echoes of his laughter still drifted back into my memory uninvited, and I still caught myself wondering how many of my smiles had been wasted on someone who never deserved them. But these thoughts no longer hollowed me out the way they once had. They were reminders, not chains. Each time the memory surfaced, I met it with the knowledge that I had not let him destroy me. Instead, I had let his own arrogance destroy him. That was the difference, and it was enough to make the ache fade into something manageable, something I could carry without breaking. The man who had walked beside me through all of this, the other betrayed, faded back into his own life once the dust cleared. We did not cling to each other out of shared suffering. We did not confuse vengeance for love. Instead, we parted ways with a quiet respect, knowing that we had been what the other needed at precisely the right moment. He had been a mirror to my pain, a partner in the strategy, a co-conspirator in the justice that neither of us could have carried out alone. We didn't promise to keep in touch, but I knew that if I ever saw him again, there would be no awkwardness, only the recognition of two people who had stood together in the storm and refused to be swallowed by it. As for them, I did not watch their every move after the final blow. There was no satisfaction in lingering over their downfall, no need to count their losses or measure their suffering. The beauty of silence is that it leaves space for distance, and in that distance, they became smaller, less significant. The world had already seen them for who they were, and that truth would follow them no matter where they went. My task was no longer to watch, but to live. I moved forward in small, deliberate steps. I returned to myself, to the things I had once neglected in the haze of trying to be enough for someone who could never be satisfied. I picked up old hobbies, reconnected with friends, allowed laughter back into my life, not the hollow kind he had trained me to accept, but the genuine laughter that comes from moments untainted by deceit. Slowly, I began to rebuild not the life we had planned, but the life I wanted for myself. And in doing so, I realized that the greatest revenge of all was not in their downfall, but in my own rising. Looking back now, the entire story feels less like a tragedy and more like a revelation. I had been tested by betrayal, mocked by arrogance, humiliated in ways that might have broken me if I had chosen the path of screaming, of begging, of letting my pain perform for them. But I hadn't. I had chosen silence. And silence, I learned, is not weakness. It is the weight of patience, the precision of truth, the refusal to play by their rules. Silence had been my weapon, my armor, my sanctuary. It had carried me through when rage might have consumed me, when grief might have drowned me, and it had delivered me, intact, to the other side. So when people asked me later why I hadn't screamed, why I hadn't confronted them directly in the moment of discovery, I only smiled, because the truth is this: not screaming was my victory. Not screaming was my revenge. Not screaming was the difference between being broken and being free. And freedom, once found, is irreversible. That is the epilogue of my story. Not the sound of my voice raised in anger, but the strength of my silence. And in that silence I found myself again, whole, unbroken, and utterly beyond their reach.